"You're going to jail for this!" Sandra Beaumont screamed as a woman possessed. Her face flushed crimson, her finger jabbing straight at my chest. 3 police cruisers blocked the entrance to my driveway. All of this was because I had refused to hand over the lake I had just legally purchased. This HOA president had completely lost control. Why I had dared to tell her one simple truth. HOA rules don't apply here. Comment below if you've ever had to deal with an HOA. Because to understand why she reacted so insanely, why she was willing to mobilize the police just to seize a lake, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to my very first day at Willow Ridge Commons, 3 months before the sirens arrived. The moving truck had pulled away exactly 47 minutes earlier when I heard the engines. I was standing on the wooden dock behind my new house, looking out at 3.2 acres of still water that caught the afternoon sun like hammered copper. Somewhere in the reeds, a heron lifted off with a slow beat of wings. I had purchased this property specifically for this view, this silence, this chance to start over after Margaret passed. The lake was not a luxury. It was the reason I had chosen Willow Ridge, and every legal document I possessed confirmed it belonged to me. But I had also chosen this place for another reason, one connected to a case I had never been able to finish. 3 years ago, a man named Douglas Mercer had contacted me about this very HOA. He described a pattern of intimidation, fraudulent fines, and financial irregularities that forced residents into compliance or out of their homes. I could not help him then. Margaret was dying, and everything else had to wait. But I kept his file. And when Lot 47B appeared on the market, I recognized the opportunity I had been waiting for. The convoy announced itself before I could turn around. 3 vehicles rolled up my gravel driveway in tight formation. A white SUV with the Willow Ridge Commons logo on the door, flanked by 2 sedans. Doors opened in unison. 5 people stepped out. 4 men in matching polo shirts, and 1 woman who walked ahead of them like a general leading infantry. She was perhaps 54, with silver blonde hair pinned back, a clipboard pressed against her chest, and a laminated badge that read, President. She stopped 6 feet from where I stood and did not offer her hand. Her expression was not angry. It was coldly administrative, the face of someone accustomed to issuing orders and watching people comply. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed. "I'm Sandra Beaumont, president of the Willow Ridge Commons Homeowners Association. We need to discuss the lake." I wiped my palms on my jeans and waited. She continued without invitation. "This body of water is classified as a common area under our community covenants. Your purchase of this lot does not include ownership of the lake. You have 72 hours to sign a voluntary transfer of usage rights to the HOA. I let the silence stretch. Behind me, the heron returned, skimming low across the water. "Do you have the deed showing HOA ownership?" I asked. Sandra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Our CCNRs clearly state that all water features adjacent to community property fall under association jurisdiction." I shook my head slowly. "CCNRs are not a deed. Mrs. Beaumont, I have recorded documents that include this lake by meets and bounds survey. More importantly, this lot was explicitly excluded from HOA jurisdiction when the subdivision was platted in 1987. I suggest you check your incorporation documents before you make demands you cannot enforce." Her mask slipped for just a moment, something flickering behind her eyes that looked less like anger and more like calculation. She was reassessing me, measuring whether I was bluffing or whether I actually knew what I was talking about. Then the mask returned. She turned on her heel and marched back toward the SUV. Over her shoulder, she shouted to her entourage, "Document everything. He's going to regret this." I watched the convoy retreat down the drive, dust rising behind the tires. My hands were steady, but my pulse was not. Douglas Mercer had warned me in his file that the HOA moved fast against anyone who challenged them. He had been blindsided. I had prepared for exactly this scenario, but seeing it unfold on day 1 confirmed everything I suspected about Sandra Beaumont. She was not defending community interests. She was protecting something else entirely. Inside the house, Cardboard boxes formed a maze I had not yet navigated. I found the one labeled Work Files and dug until my fingers touched the manila folder I had carried with me through Margaret's final months. During those long nights in hospital waiting rooms, this case had been my distraction, my way of feeling useful when I could do nothing to save my wife. The label read, Willow Ridge Commons, HOA. Whistleblower Complaint, 2021. Unresolved. I set the folder on the kitchen counter and made a phone call. They took the bait faster than I expected, I said when the line connected. Start phase 1. 2 hours later, the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox. The envelope was crisp, the letterhead embossed, and the language hostile. Unauthorized occupation of the HOA common area. It read, fine, $500 per day until compliance. I photographed the letter, logged it into a spreadsheet I had created that morning, and pinned the original to a corkboard above my desk. By nightfall, that same desk held the county assessor's map, a printout of the original subdivision plat, and a copy of the CCNRs downloaded from the HOA's own website. I added one handwritten note, check amendment history. Outside the window, the lake lay dark and silent under a quarter moon. Douglas Mercer had tried to expose this corruption alone and lost his home. $73,000 and 3 years of his life. The difference between us was simple. He had been ambushed. I had been watching, waiting, and preparing for this fight since the day I first read his file. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey, opened the county recorder's website, and began my search. Somewhere in that database was the proof I needed. Finding it would take time. Fortunately, patience was the one resource I had in abundance. 1 week after Sandra Beaumont stood on my property and demanded I surrender my lake, I had accumulated 5 violation notices, totaling $3,500 in fines. Each envelope arrived with the same embossed letterhead, the same threatening language, and the same carbon copy to HOA legal counsel. I logged them into my spreadsheet and pinned them to the corkboard, watching the pattern emerge exactly as Douglas Mercer had described. First came the demands, then came the fines, then came the pressure campaign, designed to make resistance more expensive than compliance. But Sandra had made one critical mistake. She assumed I would react the way every other resident had reacted, with confusion, fear, and eventual surrender. She did not know that I had spent 15 years as a real estate attorney before Margaret's illness forced me to step away. She did not know that I understood exactly how to dismantle a campaign built on intimidation rather than law. The county recorder's office occupied a squat brick building on the eastern edge of the county seat, 43 minutes from my front door. I arrived at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning and approached the counter where a woman in her late 50s sat behind a computer screen. Her nameplate read Doris, and she looked up at me with the weary patience of someone who had answered the same questions for 30 years. I need to request some documents, I said. Deed history for Lot 47B in the Willow Ridge Commons subdivision, the original plat map from 1987, and the HOA incorporation documents filed with the county. Doris typed slowly, squinting at the screen. Then she paused and looked at me with something that resembled curiosity. You're the second person this month asking about Willow Ridge, she said. I kept my expression neutral but filed the information away. Who was the first? She shook her head and lowered her voice slightly. Can't give names, but he was asking about the same lot you just mentioned. Left here looking like he'd seen a ghost. Douglas Mercer, I thought, or someone connected to him. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The original plat map from 1987 arrived 3 days later. I spread it across my kitchen table and studied every annotation, every legal description. There it was, exactly as I had hoped. At 40 Coenso B was outlined in red ink, and in the margin beside it, someone had written in careful handwriting, parcel not subject to HOA covenant per developer request. The notation bore the county surveyor's signature and an official date stamp. This was my foundation, the proof that my lot had been excluded from HOA jurisdiction from the very beginning. But a handwritten annotation could be challenged in court. Sandra's lawyers would call it ambiguous, unauthorized, and outdated. I needed to understand how the HOA had constructed its claim to my lake, and that meant following the money, because in my experience, fraudulent property claims are never about property alone. They are about profit, and if the HOA was willing to fabricate jurisdiction over my land, they had likely been fabricating other things for years. The answer began revealing itself when I downloaded the HOA meeting minutes from their website. Sandra had made these documents public to create an appearance of transparency, never anticipating that someone would read them with forensic attention. The minutes from 2015 through 2018 averaged 8 to 12 pages each, with detailed budget allocations, contractor bids, and voting records. Then something changed. Starting in 2019, the minutes shrank to 1 or 2 pages. Budget details vanished. Votes were recorded without context. 3 years of governance reduced to bureaucratic shorthand that concealed far more than it revealed. I pulled up the financial summary from 2018. Total HOA budget, $1.2 million. Then I checked 2023. Same number, $1.2 million. But in those 5 years, the community had grown from 220 homes to 287. Annual dues had increased by 15%. By my calculation, the HOA should have collected at least $400,000 more than they were reporting. The lake dispute was beginning to look like one piece of a much larger scheme. By day 10, Sandra escalated with the confidence of someone who had never faced real opposition. Instead of responding to my certified letter requesting a legal basis for her jurisdiction claim, she issued an amended violation notice. The daily fine jumped from $500 to $750, citing my failure to respond to official HOA communication within a mandated 72-hour window. That requirement appeared nowhere in the original CC&Rs. It was invented specifically to justify punishment. She also hired a compliance officer named Vince, a retired cop who began circling my property 4 times daily in a golf cart, photographing my windows and taking notes. This kind of open harassment would be reckless for most organizations, but Sandra operated with impunity because her husband Richard sat on the county commission. Any complaint I filed locally would land on a desk controlled by her family. She was not worried about legal consequences because she believed she owned the system that would judge her. Day 14 brought the breakthrough that changed everything. Buried in the county recorder's online database was a reference to an amendment to the Willow Ridge CC&Rs filed in 2019. The same year, the meeting minutes became suspiciously brief. I requested a certified copy and turned my attention to the HOA's legal counsel while I waited. The firm was called Wexler and Associates, based in the county seat. The managing partner, Theodore Wexler III, listed several board advisory positions in his professional profile. One immediately caught my attention. Board advisor, Suncrest Development Group. I did not yet know who Suncrest was or why they mattered, but a lawyer simultaneously advising the HOA and a development company raised obvious conflict of interest questions. I added the name to my growing list of connections and called the county surveyor's office to request a certified copy of the original plat with an official seal. The clerk told me 4 to 6 weeks. Then she paused. "That survey you're asking about," she said carefully. "Has it ever been amended?" I gripped the phone tighter. That's exactly what I'm trying to find out. The pieces were connecting in ways I had not anticipated. This fight was no longer about a lake. It was about exposing whatever Sandra Beaumont and her allies had been building in the shadows since 2019. 3 weeks into the war, Sandra Beaumont stopped pretending this was about community governance. She convened an emergency board meeting under a bylaw provision that allowed action without general membership notice if the board declared a threat to community assets. It was a procedural shortcut designed for genuine emergencies, not personal vendettas. But Sandra controlled the board, and the board controlled the definition of emergency. By the time I learned what had happened, the damage was already done. The HOA had voted unanimously to place a lien on my property. The notice arrived by certified mail from Wexler and Associates. $18,750 in accumulated fines plus legal fees. attached to the deed of Lot 47B, like a parasite. I called my bank that afternoon. The loan officer's voice was apologetic, but firm. "Mr. Holloway, we've flagged the lien on your property. Until it's resolved or removed by court order, we cannot process any transactions against your equity." Sandra had not just attacked my reputation. She had frozen my financial options completely. The lien represented less than 4% of my property's assessed value, but it created what lawyers call a cloud on title. Enough uncertainty to paralyze everything. I could not sell, refinance, or borrow against a house I owned outright. And while my finances froze, Sandra's public campaign ignited. Someone created an online group called Protect Willow Ridge Commons, and within 3 days, it had 180 members. The speed was not organic. Later, I would learn that Sandra had spent weeks priming residents through HOA email blasts and private messages, warning them about a hostile newcomer who threatened their property values. By the time the group launched, her allies had already poisoned the well. I did not join, but a neighbor forwarded me screenshots. The posts painted me as a predator, a con artist, a menace to the community. One claimed I had been sued 7 times in my legal career, a complete fabrication that spread faster than any correction could follow. The social consequences arrived with brutal efficiency. Neighbors who had waved politely during my first week now refused to make eye contact. A contractor I hired to repair my fence canceled the job after receiving what he called concerned calls from residents. The woman who ran the community garden sent me a formal letter requesting that I not attend any events until my status was clarified. Then the vandalism started. Someone smashed my mailbox with a baseball bat. 2 days later, the word thief appeared on my garage door in red spray paint. I photographed everything, filed a police report, and added the documentation to my evidence folder. The officer who took my statement seemed sympathetic, but guarded. "Look," he said quietly, "Willow Ridge disputes have a way of getting complicated. Last year, we responded to 3 calls out there, and every time the HOA's attorney sent letters to the chief. We're not eager to step into that again, unless there's something concrete." Sandra had not just isolated me socially, she had made even the police reluctant to intervene. Some nights I sat on the dock and stared at the lake, wondering if Douglas Mercer had felt this same crushing weight before he surrendered. The loneliness was not the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that everyone around me believed a lie, and I had no way to make them see the truth. Then I would remember Margaret, the way she had fought through 18 months of treatment without ever losing her dignity or her clarity. She had taught me that endurance was its own form of resistance. I would not give Sandra Beaumont the satisfaction of watching me break. I kept documenting. I kept filing requests. I kept waiting for the certified plat map that would prove my property had never belonged to the HOA in the first place. And then, on day 23, something unexpected arrived. The envelope had no return address, no postmark, just my name written in neat block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a website printed at the top, willowridgetruth.com. Below it, someone had written, "Check the 2019 amendment. Follow the money." I turned the paper over, looking for any trace of the sender. The handwriting was careful and anonymous, but the envelope itself told a story. Whoever sent this knew my address, knew I was fighting the HOA, and had been watching long enough to understand exactly what information I needed. I sat at my computer that night and typed the address into my browser. The site was bare bones, a handful of scanned documents and a timeline, but whoever built it understood evidence. Bank statements showed transfers from the HOA operating account to vendors that did not appear to exist. Invoices claimed landscaping work that exceeded the community's green space by a factor of 3. And there was a draft copy of the 2019 CC&R amendment, the same document I had been waiting weeks to receive from the county recorder. I studied it line by line. The amendment expanded HOA jurisdiction to include all water features adjacent to community property. It required a 2/3 majority of all homeowners to pass, which meant 120 votes based on the community's size at the time. The document recorded only 12 signatures. 11 belonged to board members or their immediate family. The 12th was Theodore Wexler, the HOA's own attorney, who was not even a Willow Ridge homeowner. The amendment was not just procedurally flawed, it was fraudulent. Sandra had manufactured legal authority to claim my lake using a vote that never legitimately occurred. I saved every document to my hard drive and printed backup copies. Then I wrote 2 words on a fresh sticky note and pressed it beside my monitor. Follow the money. The lake was the target, but the money was the motive, and I was finally beginning to understand just how deep this corruption went. The pickup truck pulled into my driveway on a Saturday afternoon, 5 weeks after I arrived in Willow Ridge. I was replacing the mailbox for the 3rd time when the engine cut and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 67 years old, with weathered hands, silver hair cropped short, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen decades of honest work. He walked toward me without hesitation, and something in his posture told me this was not a social visit. "You're Holloway," he said. It was not a question. I set down my tools and faced him. "I am." He glanced toward the street, checking for observers, then lowered his voice. "My name is Henry Dawson. I've lived in Willow Ridge for 22 years, and I'm the one who sent you that letter." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "I've been watching how you handle Sandra's attacks. You don't panic. You document. That tells me you might actually know what you're doing." We sat at my kitchen table with coffee. Neither of us touched. Henry explained that he had been close friends with Douglas Mercer, the man whose whistleblower file I had carried for 3 years, when Douglas first discovered financial irregularities in the HOA records. Henry had helped him gather evidence, but always from the shadows. "I never signed anything, never attended meetings, never put my name on a single document," Henry said. "Douglas was the face of the investigation. I was just the guy who drove him to the county courthouse and waited in the parking lot." That invisibility had saved him when the retaliation began. Sandra's machine had focused entirely on Douglas, never realizing that someone else held copies of everything. Henry's eyes darkened as he described the final months. "The last time I saw Douglas, he was loading a moving truck at 2 in the morning. He didn't want anyone to watch him leave. He handed me a box of files and said, 'Finish what I started.' Then he drove away and never came back." The folder Henry had carried for 3 years contained documents I had never seen before. Bank statements showing transfers from the HOA operating account to shell companies with no physical addresses, copies of checks signed by Sandra Beaumont and deposited into accounts that did not match any registered vendor. Meeting minutes from 2018 that Douglas had photographed through a conference room window, showing votes that were never recorded in the official record, and buried at the bottom, a name that made everything click into place: Suncrest Development Group. Henry watched my expression as I read. "Suncrest bought 47 acres of farmland adjacent to Willow Ridge in 2022, he said. "The old farmer who owned it died without heirs. They paid cash and closed in 3 weeks. I looked up. What does a development company want with farmland next to a residential community? Henry smiled grimly. They want to build a lakeside resort, high-end vacation homes, private beach access, the whole package. Only problem is, your lake sits right in the middle of their planned development." The connection snapped into focus. Sandra was not trying to steal my lake for the HOA. She was trying to deliver it to Suncrest. The question was why, and the answer almost certainly involved money. I asked Henry if Douglas had ever discovered what Sandra stood to gain from the arrangement. He shook his head. Douglas never found the smoking gun. He knew money was moving, but he couldn't prove where it ended up. That's why the Attorney General closed the case. I thought about the anonymous website, the careful timeline Douglas had constructed. Who maintains willowridgetruth.com now? Henry shifted in his chair. I do. Douglas built it before he left, but I've kept the hosting paid and the documents accessible, waiting for someone who could actually use them. The weight of that trust settled on my shoulders. Douglas Mercer had lost everything trying to expose this corruption. He had placed his hope in a folder passed through a truck window at 2 in the morning, and that hope had eventually found its way to me. Henry told me there was one person still inside the HOA who might help. Her name was Pamela Thornton, a 48-year-old accountant who had been elected to the board 6 months earlier. Unlike the other board members, Pamela had started finding discrepancies that could not be explained away. She told me last month that she found $87,000 in maintenance expenses for a pool house that hasn't been renovated in 15 years, Henry said. When she asked Sandra about it, Sandra changed the subject and scheduled an executive session that excluded Pamela from attendance. Sandra was already maneuvering to remove her at the next election, but for now, Pamela still had access to financial records hidden from ordinary residents. She's scared, Henry admitted, but she has a conscience, and she knows something is deeply wrong. I asked if he could arrange a meeting. Henry nodded. Somewhere outside Willow Ridge. Sandra has eyes everywhere in this community. That night, after Henry left, I sat alone in my office and began building my case in earnest. I created a secure cloud folder and uploaded every document from Henry's collection, cross-referenced against the files Douglas had originally sent me. I drafted a formal records request to the State Real Estate Commission asking for Suncrest Developments Incorporation documents and any filed complaints. I outlined a timeline of events stretching from the fraudulent 2019 amendment to Sandra's current campaign against me, noting every gap that still needed evidence to fill. The network of corruption was larger than I had imagined, stretching from the HOA board to the county commission to a development company with millions at stake. But networks have weak points. Pamela Thornton had found $87,000 that could not be explained. The certified plat map would prove the amendment was built on fraud, and somewhere in the financial records, the connection between Sandra and Suncrest was waiting to be exposed. I just needed to find it before Sandra found a way to silence me permanently. 2 months into the war, Sandra Beaumont decided that fines and liens were not enough. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who handed me the envelope and walked away without a word. The HOA was suing me in county court for trespass on common property and interference with HOA governance. They were demanding $150,000 in damages, a figure Theodore Wexler had calculated by combining alleged lost community access fees, diminished property values across the subdivision, and projected legal costs for a 5-year litigation strategy. The numbers were absurd, designed not to win in court, but to signal that fighting would cost me more than surrendering. I stood in my driveway reading the charges twice to make sure I understood what was happening. Sandra had escalated from harassment to full legal warfare. That same afternoon, the local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "Newcomer Sued for $150,000 over lake dispute." The timing was not coincidental. Sandra had sent the press release to the newspaper before the process server even reached my door. The financial noose tightened within hours. My bank called to inform me that my line of credit was frozen pending resolution of the litigation. A consulting client I had been working with quietly terminated our agreement, citing concerns about reputational association. By nightfall, I found myself standing in my garage, staring at the red spray paint on the door that I still had not bothered to cover. The word thief glowed under the overhead light, and for the first time since arriving in Willow Ridge, I allowed myself to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. I had expected resistance. I had prepared for legal battles, but I had not fully accounted for what it would feel like to be systematically erased from a community that did not even know me. The isolation was not just social, it was existential. I was fighting alone against a machine that had already destroyed Douglas Mercer, and the machine was now turning its full attention toward me. 3 days later, Henry arranged a meeting with Pamela Thornton. We met at a coffee shop 30 miles outside Willow Ridge, far enough that Sandra's network of informants could not observe us. Pamela arrived wearing sunglasses and a nervous expression, clutching her purse like a shield. She was 48 years old, precise in her movements, and clearly terrified of being seen with me. We took a table in the back corner, and she pulled out a manila folder before she even ordered coffee. "I found something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something that explains everything." She opened the folder and spread printouts across the table. They were emails, dozens of them, extracted from the HOA's internal server. Pamela explained that when she joined the board, she inherited the same administrator credentials that the previous treasurer had used. Sandra apparently never updated the access permissions. confident that no board member would have the technical knowledge or the courage to dig through archived communications. The emails told a story worse than anything I had imagined. The correspondence stretched back to 2022, a three-way conversation between Sandra Beaumont, Theodore Wexler, and a man named Marcus Webb, who identified himself as CEO of Suncrest Development Group. The messages were written in careful, indirect language, the kind of phrasing that lawyers use when they want plausible deniability. Sandra never wrote, "We will take the lake." Instead, she wrote, "We should explore mechanisms for community water access enhancement." Wexler never mentioned fraud. He discussed regulatory optimization and covenant modernization. But beneath the sanitized vocabulary, the scheme was clear. Suncrest planned to build a lakeside resort community on the 47 acres they had purchased adjacent to Willow Ridge. The development would include luxury vacation homes, a private clubhouse, and exclusive water access. The only obstacle was my lake, a parcel excluded from HOA jurisdiction since 1987. The emails showed Sandra proposing a solution she called a community benefit realignment. She would engineer a CCNR amendment expanding HOA authority to include all adjacent water features. Once the lake was under HOA control, the association would lease it to Suncrest for their development. The total value of the project, according to one email from Marcus Webb, was $2.4 million. In exchange for delivering the lake, Sandra would receive what Wexler delicately termed a facilitation honorarium of $180,000, paid through a consulting company that existed only on paper. This was not an HOA president protecting community interests. This was a criminal conspiracy to steal private property for personal profit. One email caught my attention more than the others. It was dated 3 weeks after I had moved into Willow Ridge, sent from Sandra to Marcus Webb. The message read, "Timeline complications with the 47B parcel. The owner is non-compliant. Recommend an accelerated remediation strategy." Webb's reply was brief and brutal. "Proceed as necessary. Project viability depends on water access resolution." Pamela watched me absorb the implications. "There's more," she said quietly. She pulled out one final printout, an email chain that included Sandra's husband Richard in the CC field. Richard Beaumont, the county commissioner, had been copied on a discussion about expedited zoning approval for the Suncrest project. He never responded directly, but his presence in the chain proved he knew exactly what his wife was doing. This was not just HOA corruption. This was public corruption involving an elected official. I gathered the documents carefully and looked at Pamela. "Why are you helping me?" She took off her sunglasses, and I saw that her eyes were red from exhaustion. "Because numbers are supposed to tell the truth, and these numbers have been lying for years." She stood up to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Yesterday I saw a transfer request cross my queue. Sandra is trying to move $175,000 from the reserve fund to an account labeled legal contingency. The board hasn't approved it yet, but she's pushing for an emergency vote this week." I thanked her and watched her walk out into the afternoon light. In my hands, I held the evidence that could destroy Sandra Beaumont. Now I just needed to figure out how to use it before she disappeared with everything she had stolen. The call from the county surveyor's office came on a Thursday morning, 10 weeks after I had first submitted my request. The clerk's voice was neutral but careful, as if she understood the significance of what she was about to deliver. "Mr. Holloway, your certified copy of the original 1987 plat is ready for pickup. We also located the recording history you asked about. It was misfiled in the commercial property archives back in 2019, but our digitization project flagged it last month. I was in my car within 15 minutes, driving the 43 miles to the county seat faster than the speed limit technically allowed. Doris, the same clerk who had helped me on my first visit, handed me the thick envelope with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Good luck," she said quietly. "You're going to need it." I thanked her and walked out into the afternoon sun, holding in my hands the weapon that would end this war. I cleared my desk and opened the envelope under the lamp where I had spent countless nights building my case against Sandra Beaumont. The certified plat map from 1987 confirmed everything I had suspected. Lot 47B was outlined in red ink with the handwritten annotation, "Parcel not subject to HOA covenant per developer request." But this was no longer a photocopy that could be dismissed as ambiguous. This document bore the official county seal, the surveyor's original signature, and the legal weight of certified government record receipts. My property had never been part of Willow Ridge Commons' jurisdiction. The lake belonged to me. It had always belonged to the owner of Lot 47B. Sandra's entire claim rested on a foundation that had never existed. The recording history confirmed what the anonymous website had suggested and what Pamela's emails had implied. The 2019 CCNR amendment had been filed with the county recorder, complete with an attached voting record. But the voting record was a fraud. I had already discovered through Pamela that only 12 people had signed the amendment. Now I had the official county filing, proving it. 12 signatures where 120 were required. 11 board members or relatives. One attorney had never owned property in Willow Ridge. The document Sandra had used to claim my lake was not merely procedurally defective. It was a criminal forgery filed with a government office to manufacture legal authority that did not exist. I photographed every page and uploaded them to my secure cloud folder, alongside the emails and financial records I had already assembled. I built my counterattack over the following 3 days with the precision of someone who understood that one mistake could unravel everything. First, I filed a counterclaim against the HOA in county court alleging fraud, harassment, and intentional interference with property rights. The damages I claimed totaled $500,000, calculated from the frozen credit line that had cost me a refinancing opportunity. The consulting contract terminated due to reputational harm, the lien that had clouded my title and blocked potential sales, and the documented harassment campaign that had damaged my standing in the community. The number was aggressive, but defensible. Second, I prepared a formal complaint for the state attorney general documenting the connection between Sandra, her husband Richard, and the Suncrest development conspiracy. Third, I called an old colleague named Janet Morse, who worked as an investigative reporter at the state Capitol newspaper. Janet drove down the following weekend and spent 6 hours in my office reviewing everything I had assembled. She was thorough, skeptical, and exactly the kind of journalist who would not publish anything she could not verify through independent channels. "I'll need to run these documents through our legal team before we can move forward," she said, making notes in a small leather journal. "And I'll want to contact Suncrest, Wexler's firm, and the county commissioner's office for comment. Standard procedure." By the time she left, she had copies of every document and a clear understanding of the story's scope. "If this holds up under verification," she said as she packed her bag, "Sandra Beaumont is looking at criminal charges, and her husband's political career is finished." I walked her to her car, feeling something I had not felt in weeks. Momentum. Sandra had spent 10 weeks trying to bury me. She had assumed I would break the way Douglas Mercer had broken. She had badly miscalculated. The final piece fell into place 2 days later when Pamela called with news that confirmed Sandra was preparing for battle. She had scheduled an emergency general meeting of the entire Willow Ridge Commons community for the following Saturday. The stated purpose was to authorize the board to pursue all legal options against me using the full reserve fund. But Sandra was not waiting for the meeting to shape opinion. She had already sent an email blast to all residents, warning them about a hostile outsider who was using fraudulent claims to steal community assets. The language painted me as a con artist, and her as the last line of defense protecting their property values. "She's priming them," Pamela said. "By the time they walk into that meeting, half of them will already believe whatever she tells them." I hung up the phone and looked at the evidence I had spent months assembling. Sandra wanted a public meeting where she could rally the community against me. She was going to get exactly what she wanted, but the meeting would not go the way she had planned. Not even close. The Willow Ridge Commons Community Center had never seen a crowd this large. 230 residents filled the folding chairs arranged in neat rows across the gymnasium floor, with more standing along the walls and clustered near the exits. The air was thick with tension and the hum of whispered conversations. At the front of the room, Sandra Beaumont stood behind a podium with a microphone in her hand and a projection screen glowing behind her. The first slide read, "Protecting Our Community," in bold red letters. I sat in the back row with Henry on my left. He had positioned himself near the side door, not blocking it, but close enough to observe anyone who might try to leave quietly. Pamela sat 3 rows ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. In the far corner, Janet Morse and her cameraman were setting up equipment. When Sandra demanded to know who had invited them, Janet calmly produced a copy of the HOA bylaws, highlighting Article 9.2, which classified general meetings as open to credentialed press. Sandra's jaw tightened, but the bylaw was clear. She could not force them out without violating her own rules. Sandra opened with the script she had been rehearsing for weeks. She spoke about community values, about protecting property investments, about the threat posed by outsiders who did not respect the rules that made Willow Ridge special. She never mentioned my name directly, but everyone in the room knew who she meant. The narrative was polished and persuasive, designed to transform a property dispute into a battle for survival. Several residents nodded along. A woman near the front applauded softly when Sandra finished describing the legal costs that my resistance had supposedly inflicted on the community. Not everyone was convinced, but enough people seemed ready to follow Sandra's lead. When she called for a vote to authorize access to the full reserve fund, the motion was seconded immediately. Sandra smiled and asked if there was any discussion. I stood up and walked toward the center aisle. "Madam President," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room, "Article 7.3 of your bylaws grants any homeowner the right to speak at general meetings. I'm requesting time to respond." Sandra's smile flickered. "Mr. Holloway, this meeting is about protecting our community, not providing a platform for litigation theatrics." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward with interest. I kept my voice steady. "I have certified county documents proving that the HOA's claim to my property is based on fraud. Every resident here deserves to see the evidence before voting to spend $175,000 defending it." The whispers grew louder. A man in the middle row called out, "Let him talk. What's the harm?" Others joined in, not enthusiastically but curiously. Sandra hesitated, scanning the room for allies. Finding none willing to object publicly, she stepped aside with visible reluctance. I connected my laptop to the projector and kept my presentation brief. The certified plat map appeared on screen, with the county seal clearly visible. I did not repeat the full history. I simply pointed to the annotation excluding Lot 47, B from HOA jurisdiction, and let the document speak. The next slide showed the 29th Amendment voting record. 12 signatures where 120 were required. I watched faces in the crowd shift from skepticism to confusion to something harder. An older man near the back muttered, "Nobody told us about that vote." His wife nodded grimly, but not everyone was ready to turn. A woman in the front row crossed her arms and said loudly, "How do we know these aren't fabricated?" Sandra seized the moment. "Exactly. He's manipulating you with forged documents." Her voice was stronger now. Feeding on the doubt she could still see in her parts of the room. I did not argue. Instead, I showed the email excerpts linking Sandra to Suncrest Development Group. I kept the explanation minimal, letting the highlighted phrases do the work. $2.4 million project. Facilitation honorarium. Timeline complications with the 47B parcel. The room grew quieter with each slide. When Richard Beaumont's name appeared in the CC field of the final email, someone gasped audibly. Sandra gripped the podium with both hands. "Those emails were stolen. This is a violation of privacy." Her voice had risen half an octave. Sweat glistened on her forehead. The mask of confident authority was cracking, and the cracks were spreading faster than she could repair them. Pamela stood up slowly from her seat. Every eye in the room turned toward her. "I'm the one who found those emails," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm a board member with legitimate access to HOA systems. I didn't steal anything. I followed the money, and the money led to Sandra." The room erupted into overlapping voices. Some people demanded explanations. Others defended Sandra reflexively, unwilling to believe they had been deceived for years. A man shouted about the reserve fund. A woman near the back started crying. Sandra looked around the room with something wild in her eyes, searching for support that was evaporating by the second. "You don't understand," she said into the microphone, her voice cracking. "You have no idea what it takes to run this community. The hours I've spent, the decisions I've made, the problems I've solved while all of you just lived your comfortable lives and complained about landscaping." The room grew quieter. People sensed something shifting in her tone. Sandra's hands were trembling now. The pressure of 1,000 small lies was finally collapsing inward. "I gave everything to this community," she continued, her voice rising toward a scream. 12 years of my life. And what did I get? Nothing. Every dollar I took was compensation for work that none of you ever appreciated. The silence that followed was absolute. 230 people stared at the woman who had just confessed to embezzlement in front of a journalist with a running camera. Janet Morse was already on her phone. Sandra seemed to realize what she had done. Her face went white. She looked toward the exits, but Henry had quietly moved to stand near the main door, arms crossed, expression unreadable. There was nowhere left to run. 3 months after the meeting that ended Sandra Beaumont's reign, the consequences had finished unfolding. The county sheriff arrested Sandra at her home on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The amount she had stolen over 5 years totaled $847,000, siphoned through fake vendors, inflated contracts, and the pool house renovation that had never happened. Her bail was set at $500,000. She could not pay it. Theodore Wexler faced disbarment proceedings from the State Bar Association, and his firm was named in a class action lawsuit filed by 15 Willow Ridge homeowners seeking recovery of misappropriated funds. Richard Beaumont resigned from the county commission 3 days after Janet Morse's story ran on the front page of the state capitol newspaper. A federal investigation into his role in the Suncrest zoning approvals was ongoing. Marcus Webb and Suncrest Development Group withdrew from the project entirely, unwilling to face the scrutiny that would follow any attempt to proceed. The HOA held a special election 6 weeks after Sandra's arrest. Pamela Thornton won the presidency with 78% of the vote, running on a platform of transparency and accountability. Her first act was to void the fraudulent lien on my property and issue a formal apology on behalf of the board. Her second act was to implement mandatory independent audits and require that all meeting minutes be posted online within 48 hours. The community that had once believed Sandra's lies was slowly learning to trust again. It would take time, but the foundation was solid. Douglas Mercer returned to Willow Ridge for the election. I saw him standing in the back of the community center, watching the votes being counted. When Pamela's victory was announced, he caught my eye across the room and nodded once. No words were necessary. The case he had started 3 years ago was finally closed. The lake remained mine. I had never intended to fence it off or charge for access, despite what Sandra had told the community. 2 weeks after the election, I invited my neighbors to use the dock for fishing and swimming, with no fees and no restrictions beyond common courtesy. The first family to accept was the woman who had once crossed the street to avoid me. She brought her 2 children and a cooler full of sandwiches. She did not apologize directly, but she thanked me for my generosity, and I understood what she meant. Henry Dawson became my closest friend in Willow Ridge. We spent Friday evenings on the dock with cold beers, watching the sun set over water that had nearly cost both of us everything. He told me once that Douglas had called him after the arrest, crying for the first time since he had lost his home. "You finished what I couldn't," Douglas had said. Henry raised his bottle in a toast. I raised mine in return. On a quiet Saturday afternoon, I finally painted over the word thief on my garage door. The red letters had faded over the months, but I had left them deliberately as a reminder of what I had survived. Now it was time to let them go. I covered the stain with 3 coats of white paint until no trace remained. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at the clean surface, then turned to face the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the blue sky and the trees along the shore. Margaret would have loved this view. I had bought this property to honor her memory, to find the peace she had always wanted for both of us. Standing there with paint on my hands and sunlight on my face, I finally felt like I had found it. The fight was over. Justice had been served. And for the first time in a very long time, I was home. Sometimes, the people who abuse power believe they are untouchable. They count on silence, isolation, and fear to protect them. But the truth has a way of surfacing when someone refuses to back down. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that fighting back is possible. Subscribe to Karma Neighbors for more stories of ordinary people who stood up against injustice and won. And remember, the only thing bullies fear more than exposure is a community that refuses to look away.